I'm Taylor Riggs in San Francisco in for Emily Chang, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, interference. We continue our coverage of cyber risks from the U.S.'s strained relationship with Iran. We are looking at the threats you can't see. Plus, counsel dismissed. Alphabet's top lawyer leaves after questions about a workplace relationship persist. David Drummond says it's time for new leadership at the company. We have details. And the week that was, Elon has a reason to dance, and Apple hits more milestones. That plus CES highlights with Loop Ventures' Gene Munster. But first, to our top story, and that is the Trump administration is imposing new sanctions on Iran, retaliation for Tehran's attack on U.S. military bases. Now, the sanctions target the nation's steel industry as well as 8 senior Iranian officials. Now, while adversaries didn't get into traditional military war, their continued cyber warfare remains. Cybersecurity firm Dragos published a report on Thursday highlighting possible hacking activity by an Iranian-linked group against U.S. power suppliers. So for more, we've got Ron Gula in Washington. He's the president of Gula Tech Adventures, and prior to that, he was a hacker for the NSA. And in studio with me here, it is Proofpoint Executive Vice President for Cybersecurity Strategy, Ryan Kallenberg. Ryan, let me start with you. What types of increase have you seen in the recent weeks coming from Iran targeting the U.S.?
Well, we've seen a continuation of a lot of campaigns that they were already running. At this point, we're tracking 11 different Iranian actors. And perhaps the most interesting thing we saw some of them move from diplomatic targets, public policy targets, government targets, your classic sort of intelligence gathering activities, to actually target some civilian organizations, specifically in life sciences.
Very interesting. And Ron, I mean, given your background here, what do you see as the path of least resistance for Iran to do the most damage on the U.S.?
So Iran can they can target soft targets, people like you and me, small businesses, small corporations. So anybody who's out there is trying to think about protecting themselves, now's the time to think about their connection to the internet, their connections to the cloud, and what they can do to increase their cyber hygiene.
So Ryan, you mentioned a lot of now civilian targets, a little bit of a shift in strategy. When you say civilian targets, what do you mean?
Well, I mean private corporations rather than government entities or even, frankly, NGOs or other policy organizations. What's interesting is that if you put yourself in the shoes of the Iranians, they're about to deal with much tighter sanctions. They have to feed their population. They have to provide things like essential medicines. So to me, it actually makes perfect sense that they'd start to target organizations like life sciences firms.
And Ryan, when you take a look at sort of the access to U.S. Utilities, is that sort of a very classic way in which they could do harm, create chaos via a blackout, for example?
Well, certainly the Russians have pioneered that playbook and have used it extensively in region against Ukraine. The Iranians we have seen certainly targeting utilities over a fairly extended period of time, and they have also done destructive attacks. That hasn't necessarily translated into actually taking power grids offline. That's a completely different level of expertise. But all of those things, frankly, should be on the table when it comes to planning for defending.
And Ron, let me pull you back in here, because you seem to take a little bit of a different point of view, that perhaps we wouldn't see a mass blackout type scenario. Why do you think that?
So Iran has many options when it comes to taking action in cyberspace. If they did something like attack the city of Baltimore, attack the city of Atlanta, and claim credit for it, they're going to invite a strong response from the United States. I don't think they're going to do just that. Having said that, their primary goals in cyberspace are going to be gathering information and gathering intelligence about U.S. policy. So anybody who's a vendor for the United States or working with the U.S. government, they're potentially a target, and they should be, giving a second look at their cyber defenses.
So that pulls us back into Ryan, as they're taking a look now at going back at their cyber defenses. What do you recommend to some of these corporations and even people, perhaps, about what they can do?
Well, I think you have to look at what the Iranians are good at, and they're good at what we call social engineering. They're excellent at running phishing campaigns. The lures we've just even seen in the past week or so are really compelling. They're the sort of things that people would click on were they not really, really aware of the threat that attachments to emails, links in emails might actually pose. They've also hammered on cloud services like Office 365 accounts. And really, the Iranian playbook is very, very similar to the cybercriminal playbook in general. So I think Ron's spot on. Everybody should be concerned about their cyber hygiene, but the sort of things that you would do to defend against most Iranian attacks, frankly, work in general. The other thing I'd point out is that the CISA, which is of course part of Homeland Security, had some fantastic advice on how every single organization and person can keep themselves safe. And one of the things was offline backups. Now, the same things that we've heard about in the ransomware crisis, which has hit lots of cities and other organizations around the country, that's a fantastic way to prepare yourself for a potentially destructive malware attack.
And Ron, I mean, formerly at the NSA, what do you think of? Does the U.S. Start hacking back? I mean, how do governments and corporations here, what's the best preventative ways for them to brace for a potential Iranian cyber warfare?
So I don't think we really know what cyber warfare looks like. If you compare and contrast Iran's capabilities with the U.S.'s, President Trump, after the Global Hawk drone was shot down, we took offensive cyber action as it was reported. And that's completely different than the capabilities from Iran. They get to target businesses and corporations, and that's where us as U.S. citizens, we can have a lot of impact by controlling what's on our own network.
Ron Gula of Gula Tech Adventures and Ryan Kallenber of Proofpoint, thank you both for joining. And coming up, phase one about to be done. We break down what to expect in next week's trade deal and what's left for phase two. That's next. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. You can listen on the Bloomberg app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on SiriusXM. This is Bloomberg. President Trump says the U.S. and China are set to sign a historic phase one trade deal on Wednesday. And President Trump's top economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, laid out what this means for the tech industry when speaking to Bloomberg on Friday.
We got tremendous amount of progress on intellectual property and the avoidance of theft and counterfeiting. Tremendous amount. And with respect to the forced transfer of technology, some progress has been made there, too. More will spill over into phase two.
To take a look into phase one and what's to come in phase two in New York, we've Isaac Stonefish, a senior fellow at the Asia Society, and in Los Angeles, Sarah McGregor, who leads Bloomberg's coverage of U.S. economic policy. Sarah, let me start with you. We're still waiting on phase one. What are the odds now that we could see a potential for phase two?
Absolutely. So the expectation is on Wednesday next week, on the 15th, a Chinese delegation led by Liu He, the top trade negotiator, they'll be in D.C. and they'll sign this phase one deal. We've heard from the Trump administration that finally we should receive an actual text of what is in that deal. You know, we have comments from people like we just played, Larry Kudlow, saying, believe us, there's things on IP theft, there's strong commitments on, tech transfers and other types of things, but we haven't really seen the nuts and bolts of that. And so I think that's the first thing that we need to check off the list. And after that, we see, potentially the phase two part of the deal starting. That being said, Trump said himself this week that might not come until after the elections. And so I think there's a lot of skepticism about if he is reelected, will that ever come? Will the political motivation be there for him if he's reelected for a second term?
So, Isaac, your thoughts on what we got in phase one and if that leads us any closer to phase two?
I think it has to lead us closer because it's a step in the direction, but I think we got very little in phase one. It's sort of a agreement to have an agreement to have an agreement, and it seems pretty vanishingly short on details. I also, with Trump saying, oh yeah, maybe we have to wait until after the election, it really does seem to be hey, trust me, I'm working really hard for you. Here's a little bit of a deal, and then vote for me, and you'll get more of a deal.
Sarah, we heard Larry Kudlow on Bloomberg this morning talking a lot about getting big concessions from China with relationships to technology, like that IP theft, like that forced technology transfers. What specific details, as we know, the devil's in the details when it comes to these trade deals, what are you really looking for as it relates to those two topics in phase one?
So a big issue when the talks failed in May was that China had come back to the U.S. with this draft text and really scaled back on some of its commitments to codify into law changes that would help protect, the intellectual property of foreign companies like U.S. companies that are working in China and various other commitments. It's sort of shrunk back from those, and there's a bit of a complex system there to understand of how China exactly codifies with laws with many different layers. But the U.S. was not happy with what China was offering, and so I think a key question when people who really look at this text and know the itty-bitty details of Chinese law, it will be whether they've actually made a hard and fast commitment. And if they don't live up to those commitments on things like IP theft or tech, what will be the repercussions? What is the enforcement mechanism in place so the U.S. can say you're rolling back on these commitments that you've made?
Isaac, why has it been so difficult to get us all on the same page when it comes to IP theft and these forced tech transfers?
I think you have two countries that have pretty different interests in this. I think sort of like it was with the US and the UK 150 years ago, a lot of the best technology is still at the hands of American companies, and Chinese companies want to get their hands on that technology, and some of them use illegal means to do so. And I think on the one hand, there are many people inside the Communist Party who want the country to be ruled more by laws as opposed to by party diktat. But there are a lot of people at the top of the party who feel like what the party says is what should matter. And so that if a certain company, especially a certain state-owned company, if them forcing technology transfer or even actual IP theft, if that's in the interest of the party, it's something they should just do regardless of the laws.
Isaac, when we came out of phase one news, it was clear that Apple, for example, was a clear winner, avoiding tariffs on the iPhone, for example. What other companies do you see as really benefiting on a real signing of phase one and then a potential phase two?
I see Tesla really benefiting for something like this because they are doubling down on their plants in China. There's just that crazy dance that Elon Musk did at his plant in Shanghai. And there are a lot of companies that have a lot at stake in the US-China relationship. And it's less something that specifically translates to the numbers, but more is on whether or not the party and also Chinese consumers feel goodwill towards the company. We saw this with Apple and with Huawei, the Chinese tech giant, when the Canadians arrested Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei CFO, there were people who wanted to boycott Apple. And so there's a lot of issues about just sort of goodwill that Chinese feel towards American companies and the way the party feels towards American companies that could play out in a lot of different interesting ways going forward.
And Sarah, as you cover U.S. economic policy, does any of this U.S. goodwill, if you will, from American companies help? I mean, we talk about Tim Cook at Apple having a good relationship, and you talk about Elon Musk over at Tesla going to Shanghai and trying to build a factory. Does any of that make a difference?
I think it makes a difference on the Trump administration for certain. We know that, Steve Jobs, for instance, has spent some time at the White House and has met with Trump. And for that reason, Apple has been able to escape some of those tariffs, to get exclusions for tariffs that were put into place, for instance. And that just is an indication of the leverage that some of these American companies have. They, of course, want to keep access open to the Chinese market. This whole trade war started on the premise of, the Trump administration saying it was going to bat for U.S. businesses, trying to level the playing field to make it easier for them. And really, I think what it's probably hearing from some of these companies right now is that there has been some harm caused to it by them, and they want the dust to settle a bit more than it has been for the past couple of years. And so, this push for a deal is definitely part of, I'm sure, that corporate lobby that the Trump administration.
Another C-suite shakeup at Google. Alphabet's top lawyer, David Drummond, is retiring at the end of January. The company veteran steps down following questions about his conduct at the tech giant. Drummond's exit comes after recent departures of Google's founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, from their roles. He was Google's first lawyer before shifting to parent company Alphabet in 2015. For more, I'm joined by Bloomberg's Mark Bergen, who covers the company for us. What do we know about the departure?
This was sort of a long time coming. David Drummond had been at the companies you mentioned for a very, very long time. He was sort of formidable in its early rise. He's been associated with both the sort of old school Google, but also more recently with a lot of their problems around men in particular and allegations of sexual harassment. So he was the top lawyer when the Andy Rubin dispute, which was the former head of Android who left with this big pay package and spurred the Google walkout. He's had issues around allegations with some of the extramarital affairs with former Google employees. There are a lot of women at Google, and men as well, but are saying, why is he still around? Like, what sign is this showing? And clearly now we have Sundar taking over, and then a month later, David Drummond stepping away.
And on that note, what does this tell us about Google's shifting strategy, perhaps in taking a closer look at relationships conducted in the workplace? Is this a shift on a more broader level?
Yeah, I think this is a shift. Certainly, there's both internal and external pressure, right, from their own employees and from shareholders and just from the general public after the Me Too movement. There's a general sense that this sort of baggage that these executives had was much more of a hindrance. And David Drummond, like the founders, has kind of largely taken a step back, has retreated from day-to-day operations. Really unclear. He was running, he was managing Google Ventures and Capital G, their big investment arms, as well as Jigsaw. But it wasn't clear if he certainly wasn't as involved as he was a decade ago when he was much more led their corporate development and their legal strategy.
I think this also brings up a bigger change given the shakeup in top management that we've seen. I mean, we sat here last year when Sergey and Larry stepped down, and no offense, but we basically said no one cares because Sundar, it was so clear of his strategy following in the steps of Google. Is there that same sort of confidence in the next generation of the legal team that we had when the founder stepped down and we had so much confidence in Sundar?
Yeah, so Kent Walker has been the chief legal officer for Google since 2015 and was a deputy under David Drummond for a long time. Before that, I think they have Google has one of the biggest legal teams probably of any tech companies. I think the question that this poses is more around the other parts of Alphabet, which is not Google. So Drummond's remit was everything that was not Google. The company is not named the replacement. It's not clear if there's going to be one. That'll be interesting to see, right? If they actually appoint someone to run what he was effectively doing, which was the legal and corporate development for everything outside from Waymo to Verily, to those divisions, if they think that needs that executive level seat or not.
Well, and Bloomberg's Mark Bergen stays with us because I want to pivot to another big Google story that we're watching. And in the wake of Amazon's stumble, Google quietly expands in New York City. The tech giant has added thousands of jobs since it showed up in the Chelsea neighborhood in 2006 without provoking much ire. Also joining us to talk about this story is Bloomberg's Natalie Wong in New York to really talk about how Google has navigated the city's real estate landscape so far. Natalie, what did they learn perhaps from Amazon in deciding to take a different approach?
I guess the lesson that you can really see in contrasting both Google's approach to building an empire in a city versus Amazon's approach is that it takes time, you have to be incremental, and you have to work with the local community. Google came here in 2006 and set up shop in the Chelsea neighborhood while it was already gentrifying, but they leased up space first and then slowly but surely started to buy up the real estate, started to expand further, and they did it while working with the community in Chelsea. Whereas Amazon kind of came in a really flashy way, in a public way, did not really engage with the local community on the grounds of Long Island City, and that clearly was a hindrance to them when they had all of that critique against them once it was announced that they would set up shop there.
And Mark, we're showing sort of visual pictures of Google's presence in New York, and there were a few strategies that struck out to me. One was they're not changing the exterior of their buildings. They're not building these big, tall, glass, modern buildings, but they're also taking a very different monetary approach as well, not asking for subsidies. What do you make of those two strategies that they've really both taken on?
The first one is very marked difference from, say, their headquarters in Mountain View. If you remember a couple of years ago, they had these big, ambitious plans. They hired one of these architects. They were going to do these sort of modular offices. It was very much like a Google moonshot. This is much more staid, and I think in part a reaction to looking at what happened to Amazon, a lot of the political backlash. Google clearly wants to be as far away from that backlash as possible. I think the other interesting thing about their strategy when they initially bought the large building in, I think, 2010 in New York, that was above these fiber optic cables beneath the surface. And a lot of what Google does is they think about how are we going to actually, this was for their data centers, right? And this is pipe.
Bloomberg Technology. I'm Taylor Riggs in San Francisco. All week, some of the biggest names in tech gathered in Las Vegas for the annual CES conference. The main theme centered on connecting and interconnecting devices to the internet and to each other as we edge closer to a wireless and more automated world. 5G playing a big role in that conversation. To discuss this and the other big tech stories of the week, we're joined by Gene Munster of Loop Ventures and also with us, John Butler of Bloomberg Intelligence. John, as you took a look at some of the highlights of CES, what stood out to you this year relative to previous years?
So you mentioned it at the top, Taylor. To me, the big overriding theme was about interconnecting devices and getting devices connected to the internet. And what I mean by that is the connection of everything, not just your smartphone or PC, but also your refrigerator, your car, your television. And that was sort of the talk of the town, if you will, as I went from discussion to discussion. Everyone brought that up. And of course, underlying all of that needs to be a foundation of 5G.
Gene, as you take a look at CES, big notable changes in your opinion?
I think it was more subtle. I do think that there was a page turn from this connected device theme like John talked about. Absolutely agree with that. I think that there is this progressive, it's been there in previous years, but more this year about the intelligence layer. Overused phrase AI machine learning, but I think that there was some kind of pointed examples of how not just a connected device, but a smart device, for example, like an Oral-B toothbrush that senses if you're pushing too hard, and that based on your age can impact the health of your gums and your enamel on your teeth, things like that. So it's this next step forward. I think that was one piece. Also caught my attention. I think we're getting closer to foldable tech, foldable computers, foldable phones, and lastly, wearables. Even though that theme has been around a long time, I feel like that is continuing to move from a small percentage of people to what I think eventually is going to be on everyone's wrist.
John, I'm reading through your note, and some of it's Amazon's Alexa thinks big and Google talks integration, and it made me think if we're talking about being seamless and interconnected and being omni-channel, how close are we from going to my house to car and then also going from my Amazon Alexa to my Google device? Are we truly going to be able to go everywhere despite any hardware or software?
I think I'd answer it this way, Taylor. We're going to get 7 to 10 years down the road and be astounded at how far we've come. But I think between now and then, the network needs to get built to really support that, the 5G network. And, my best guess is we're really, here in the U.S., 3 to 5 years away from really having, I would say, major coverage across the top 100 markets in the U.S. And then you really need to seed the market with devices. So, again, I think we're in for a real good surprise 7 to 10 years down the road. But in the meantime, we're really in what I'll call that build phase leading up to it.
Yeah, Gene, would you agree that we're still a few ways away from 5G despite all of the hype and all of the talk? This may not be a 2020 story, as John mentioned.
Definitely not agree with John and have a slightly different time frame, but agree with the takeaway, which is 5G is further away. We've been influenced by the 4 major carriers and what they've said about 5G adoption, using words like or phrases like nationwide by the end of 2020. But that does not really speak to the true coverage where you can get consistent coverage through the day. And that's what John's talking about, that kind of 5 to 7 years. I think that we're at a point of 75%, to me, 75% of the U.S. Coverage sometime early in 2022. So I think we're probably 2 years away from that, well behind some of the expectations. It is important to, I think, take away from this that even though 5G is going to take longer than we think, I think its impact on how we use devices and what we can do is going to be more profound than what we can imagine.
John, how behind are we relative to some of the other Asian nations, which frankly already have nationwide 5G?
Well, I don't think the early part of the race is all that important, but we are behind countries like South Korea, for example. Believe it or not, some of the Nordic nations are ahead of us. But, you know, as Gene said, I think within 3 years we'll probably reach that nationwide coverage, at least in the top markets. And it's really, this is the kind of market, it's where you finish, not where you start, that really matters. And I think the U.S. will get where it needs to be pretty comfortably within a 5-year time frame.
Gene, final question here on 5G. Is it all the hype? Is it all the rage, especially as we talk about AI and some of the major things that can be done on 5G speed? Will it live up to its hype?
I think it will, and it's important to note that 5G is not about like faster downloads on for video starting faster on your phone. The ability to take a cloud scale computing, which is currently done in the cloud, and be able to do that on a mobile device is essentially what 5G enables. And right now, the speeds just aren't fast enough to do that. So the processing is done on the connected device, whether it's a mobile phone or some other internet connected device. So that opportunity, that option, that opportunity of adding cloud scale computing to a mobile device, I think, is a big deal. What it empowers, some specifics, is augmented reality moves forward. I think you look at autonomous vehicles, vehicle-to-vehicle communication, and just intelligence at cloud scale in any connected device. It is quite remarkable what 5G ultimately can do for us.
John, you mentioned not only is it the 5G network, but the devices as well that are compatible with 5G. And there's been a lot of hype about Apple and the upgrade within the iPhone cycle, even without a 5G phone until next September. How do you view Apple in the midst of this big? Earlier this week, Tesla CEO Elon Musk had something to celebrate. Tesla has kicked off production in China, and the company handed over the first China-made Model 3 sedans to the public. And now Tesla's growth potential in the country, it's exciting Wall Street. Rounding out the week, analysts at Piper Sandler boosted their price target by more than 30%. So still with us, it is Gene Munster of Loop Ventures. So Gene, I have to ask, again, as you sort of saw that big jump in China and the big sort of success in China, is that what you had predicted, or were they more successful than perhaps you thought they would be?
Move faster than what I thought. They had set that expectation of the Gigafactory in Shanghai being open by the end, producing cars by the end of 2019. Just given Tesla's history of missing its targets, I had expected that to be sometime in the first quarter. Even at that, they did it in a year, which is remarkable, and give them credit for doing that. I think when you take a step back and think about what does that mean for the company more broadly this year, the analysts overall are kind of thinking somewhere between 30 and 100,000 vehicles from the Shanghai. But at the current rate, the current capacity, and this is surprising, is it's already producing 3,000 vehicles per week. So it can produce 150,000. And then the question is, will they sell all the cars that they produce? And I think that when you put all this together, what investors are going to be looking at keenly this year is, will they hit that 463,000 delivery number for full 2020? Adding another, call it 100,000 from China, I think gets you quickly to that goal.
Gene, I think the numbers that you said there were 3,000 a week. We remember Elon Musk talking about that, quote, production hell that he was facing in the first round of those Model 3s out here in California. How did they avoid that over in China?
Well, they're basically building these factories. They're almost printing them out. They've already done that blueprint. And I think that this is clearly evidence that they're getting better at making cars. And if you fast forward 2 years from now, as they move into Germany with the Berlin Gigafactory, I think that should also ramp quickly there. But that's essentially how they do it. They worked out the problems in Fremont, and then now they've exported that to China.
Gene, this is a question that's not quite a fundamental analysis question, but I'm curious to get your thoughts. When we talk about China and trade, a lot of the risks, we heard this with Micron, for example. You go over there, you're very successful, but then China steals the technology and kicks you out. Is that at all a risk when you look at Tesla going over there, getting very good reception? Is their technology and their patents strong enough to withstand any potential theft from China?
I think the company Tesla has a different view about patents. The company is more of the nature that they will get the technology out there. They'll put it out there. They've done that with some of their autonomous technology. Is just put it out there for other people to use because they figure that someone else is going to copy it or steal it, and ultimately you need to move in a different direction to have a competitive advantage. So I don't think that is a particular risk here to China. I think that awareness that you really can't rely on a patent to be successful. I think that insight from Tesla is something that is somewhat unique and a competitive advantage for them. And to kind of add a different or another piece to that is they're embracing even further. They're now are going to do a design studio in China that's going to produce vehicles just for China that will be less expensive versions of Model 3, maybe a Model 2, whatever you would call it. But I think that is an example of them really fully embracing the good and the bad, and ultimately seeing a large opportunity in China. Largest EV market in the world, about half of EVs sold globally are in China.
Gene, I want to come and take a look at a chart here that I'm showing inside my terminal. It was another big milestone this week for the company. Their market cap eclipsed $88 billion earlier this week. It's fallen now down to about $86 billion, but notably it had eclipsed that of both Ford and GM combined. Who are Tesla's competitors? Can anyone even at this point keep up?
Well, it's I'll start with the end here. I think that over time the stock will go higher. I think it will be an up and down road for the stock, but I do think it goes higher. I think there is competition out there. I don't think the competition has a material impact on their business in this year. In the U.S. right now, they have 70% share of the EV market. That obviously is difficult to sustain, but if you even take that down to over time, 20%, for example, that would outpace GM's market share in the U.S. So the answer is it's difficult to compete with them, and I think they're going to continue to make fast tracks towards that 460,000 vehicles this year.
And finally, one last question to you, Gene. What did you make of Elon's comments when he said that the Model Y would eclipse demand of all of the other vehicles combined?
Appreciate the enthusiasm around it. I think that it probably won't be the case. I mean, they just when you look at, they still got some great Cybertruck as opinionated as people are about that. Model 3, I think they've got a lot of great things. Model Y is going to be a big success. That's his point, and I would agree with that. This is going to be a needle mover for the company.
Well, I always appreciate the enthusiasm that Gene Munster of Loop Ventures brings. Thank you as always for joining us. And it's still ahead. Facebook finally makes a change in its political ads, but is it enough to quiet critics? That is our conversation next. This is Bloomberg. After months of resisting criticism about its political ads policy, Facebook says it will now give users the option to see fewer political and social issues ads in their feeds. But the social network still maintains its stance against fact-checking politicians. Facebook announced the new user settings on Thursday. So to discuss, we have Bloomberg's Kurt Wagner here. Why now and why the change?
Well, perhaps you've heard over the last 3 months that everyone is very upset with Facebook's ads policy, their political ads policy. So they've been kind of saying routinely throughout the last couple months that they were looking at different options around ad targeting. They weren't really committing to revisiting their stance on fact-checking ads, but there has just been a lot of discussion. And so they finally come out yesterday with this blog post, as you mentioned, and they didn't actually change any of the policies that people are upset about. Instead, they came out and said, here's a new setting for users. If you want to see fewer political ads, you can check this new box in your settings and we'll show you fewer ads. That's on you, the user. Our policies, though, are not changing.
Frankly, from the user perspective, I wonder if there has been positive reception. Because if I'm going on, let's say, to wish my third cousin happy birthday, I'm not going on to engage in a political dialogue and some of the divisiveness. So does that help from the user's perspective now maybe want to go on more if we can ignore some of the political ads?
Well, that's what Facebook would argue, and I think that there's a very valid argument to be made, right? Is that not everyone wants a political experience when they log on, especially on Instagram, right? This is a network where it's often your friends, it's food, it's vacations, it's not politics usually for most people, and so this applies to Instagram as well. And this is what Facebook, this is how they frame this. They were like, this is something people have been asking for. We're now giving them that option that they didn't have before. But again, people who are critical of the policies might not be appeased.
How upset, though, then are the advertisers knowing that I can unsubscribe, if you will?
I think they would be more upset if they had taken away any of the targeting, because the targeting is really the secret sauce, if you will, of social media. Not so secret anymore after the amount of money that Facebook makes, but that would have been a big deal for advertisers. That would have limited their ability to upload an email list, for example, of potential voters and really reach them. So I think they're going to be okay with this because, let's be honest, most people probably aren't going to use it. I think most people keep the settings the way that they are when they log in. They don't go and make the effort to go through and personalize them themselves. So because this is one of those opt-in type of features, I imagine most people will probably not even use it.
And you brought up that ad targeting policies. We know that's sort of where the real money is. Now, how does Facebook now compare in that ad targeting policy relative to Google, as we've seen, and perhaps Twitter?
Yeah, so both Google and Twitter obviously have made changes to this for political ads specifically. Twitter got rid of most political ads, and they said if you want to do an issue ad, you have to limit your targeting. I think it's state level, for example. You couldn't go in and target by a zip code. And what the companies, Google and Twitter, are kind of doing here is they're saying that political messages can't be super tailored to a specific group of people, to a specific neighborhood or county. Instead, you need to be speaking to a broader group. And Facebook does not have that right now. So in theory, again, if you're a political candidate, you can really get targeted with your messaging. And some people believe that that's not a good way to disseminate this information.
And making a pivot a little bit to a different story that you were covering about Facebook this week, Zuckerberg writing that he's ending his annual personal challenge to focus on Facebook. Do we care?
I guess we care. We wrote it up. These things are the kinds of things that people in technology have looked forward to, if you will, or at least come to expect, maybe not look forward to. And I get why he did it. He's been really criticized the last couple of years. You may remember a few years ago, his goal was to go to all 50 states. Everyone thought maybe he's running for president. Last year, he said he was going to get out and talk with a group of people about the future of technology. He talked to a bunch of mostly white men. It wasn't a very expansive group. And so these have given people a good reason to kind of come out and criticize Mark Zuckerberg in recent years. And so at this point, you should probably just focus on Facebook.
Focus on Facebook. That's what Kurt Wagner does. He's with us from Bloomberg. Thank you for joining. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. Bloomberg Technology is live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology. Be sure to follow our global breaking news network at Quick Take on Twitter. This is Bloomberg.